Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
It's pretty obvious that grass plants are different than broadleaf plants, but one of the things you may not realize is so different between the two is the number of growing points that each has.
Yeah, this is a really big deal, especially when we talk about how we're going to control these weeds. So we want to talk about grass, we want to talk about broadleaves, and then we also need to talk about the difference between annuals and perennials with rhizomes and the number of growing points there.
Okay, I want to make one point right off the bat, and you talk about controlling weeds. I'm thinking about growing crops. Early season, what crops are we planting? We're planting things like wheat and corn. And you say, well, okay, why are you planting those crops rather than something like soybeans, for example? Well, here's a big reason why. When we put corn in the ground, that seed is down a couple inches deep. The growing point of corn is going to stay beneath the soil surface until that plant is about 6 or 8 inches tall in many cases. So if we do happen to get a freeze or some very cold weather early in the season, the growing point is safely below that plant underneath the soil where it's still a little bit warm. With soybeans, for example, their growing points are all going to be above the soil surface as soon as that plant emerges from the ground. So if, for example, you would get a light frost and you had soybeans up, well, it's not going to end well for you because it's going to kill all those growing points above ground and the plant will be dead.
Well, not necessarily a light frost, but a hard frost, yes. If it kills everything above ground, you're done. Whereas with corn or wheat, if that plant is small enough, it might kill everything above ground and the plant's still going to live. So this is really important in understanding these plants. Additionally, with corn, we only have the one growing point. So we've really got to be careful about that growing point, protect that growing point, and that growing point eventually will go up to the tassel. But initially, that growing point is going to be below ground until we hit about the V6 stage, so about 6 collar corn. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So if we've got corn smaller than V6, we're usually pretty safe from frost. After V6, that's where we really have to start to worry.
With broadleaf plants, they're going to have multiple growing points. Now, it depends on the plant as to how many growing points they have. But when we look at small weeds, for example, like a kochia plant or a lamb's quarters plant, they're going to have quite a few growing points already by the time we've got a 4-inch tall weed. So in many cases, you'll read on herbicide labels or get advice from an agronomist that you need to get that weed under control in the 2 to 4-inch tall stage. After that, it gets very difficult to control. One of the big reasons why is once it gets bigger, it has that many more growing points that you have to try and kill.
Where these growing points are in most broadleaf plants is they're going to be right where the main stem connects to all these little branches that go off of that main stem. Usually at each one of those stems, there's one growing point, and then at the top of a small plant, there might be 3 to 10 growing points kind of in that cluster right at the top. Okay, so this also is a discussion when we talk about annual plants versus perennial plants. When we have rhizomes, a lot of times people talk about, oh, tillage is great to kill weeds. Well, it's great for a lot of weeds, but not for these big plants that have rhizomes. So it's these roots below ground that can also have growing points on them. And if you go along and you slice that plant up, you might have 20 plants that all individually now come up because you split the main plant up.
Let me give you an example of rhizomes. Let's look at quack grass, for example. We'll see this many times pop up in yards, and it's a very thick, wide blade grass, and then it also has rhizomes. So you may go out and say, man, I've got this different color grass out in my yard that gets bigger than the rest of my grass. So I'm just going to go out and pull that clump of grass out and get rid of it. And when you try to pull it, you can't really pull it. And even when you do, the root system breaks off because it runs down and over. And oftentimes a day or two later, you see some new shoots coming up a few inches off to the side of where you just pulled that plant. It's very difficult to control those perennial weeds. The same is true for farmers out in their fields. When they've got rhizomes like that, it's really difficult to get those weeds under control. If we're using a herbicide, we have to use a strong enough dose of a product that's going to move down through that root system and carry a lethal dose to each one of those growing points in order to kill it.
Understanding growing points in farming, in agriculture in general, is incredibly important, and there is a big difference between annuals and perennials. There's a big difference between broadleaves and grass plants. Well, one of those broadleaf plants that we want to talk about and how to control it is coming up later in the show as our Weed of the Week.